As President of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organization responsible for the creation and upkeep of the magnificent and deeply moving Menin Gate, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to thank the people of Flanders, and especially Ypres and members of the Last Post Association, for continuing to honor the sacrifice of our fallen.
The quiet halls of the royal estate have been rocked by an unexpected and explosive intervention from the Duke of Kent. In a series of private conversations now leaking into the public sphere, the Duke has shattered the royal protocol surrounding the family's most sacred heirlooms. He has openly declared that the historic crown jewels currently associated with Queen Camilla should bypass her entirely and instead be bequeathed to Catherine, Princess of Wales. This unprecedented challenge to the traditional line of succession has sent shockwaves through the monarchy. As the king faces pressure to address this bold demand, the question remains: is this a final act of legacy protection, or the spark that ignites a new royal war? The Duke's proclamation, breaking the silence. The sunroom at the Duke of Kent's private residence was bright with morning light. He sat in a high-backed leather chair. He was holding a copy of the morning paper. He did not look at the headlines about the palace restructuring. He looked at the photograph of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, on the back page. He set the paper down on the side table. He called his assistant into the room. He told him that he had something to say. The fact is that the Duke of Kent has been a pillar of the monarchy for decades. He has attended thousands of engagements. He has served the late Queen with total loyalty. He knows the weight of every piece in the royal collection. He has seen the jewels change hands through generations. He believes that the collection is not just a set of ornaments. He views it as the history of the house rendered in gold and stone. Tension filled the small room. The assistant hesitated. He knew the protocol. He knew that senior royals did not speak on the distribution of assets. He knew the risk involved in challenging the status quo. The Duke did not blink. He repeated his instruction. He wanted his views to be made known to the king's private secretary. He wanted it done before the end of the day. The message was clear. The Duke argued that the historic jewels currently held by Queen Camilla were part of a specific legacy. He believed they belonged in the hands of the future queen. He cited the historical precedents where jewels were passed down to ensure continuity. He argued that the current distribution was a disruption of that continuity. He was effectively calling for a bypass of the queen's inheritance. The mystery was why he chose this moment to speak. The palace was already in a state of high alert due to the internal audit and the recent confrontations. Every word from an elder member of the family was being scrutinized for hidden motives. Some wondered if the Duke was acting on behalf of a faction within the family. Others wondered if he was simply acting on his own belief in the importance of the tradition. The mystery resolved itself when the Duke mentioned his granddaughter in the same breath as Catherine. He said that he was thinking of the long-term survival of the monarchy. He wanted to ensure that the icons of the institution were placed in hands that would be seen as stable for the next 50 years. He was not looking to start a war. He was looking to secure the legacy. The facts were that the Duke had spent time with the Princess of Wales during the summer events. He had been impressed by her composure during the latest rounds of negative press. He saw her as the only figure who could unite the public. He viewed her as the anchor of the institution. He believed that the jewels served a symbolic purpose that only she could properly fulfill in the coming decades. A new mystery emerged by noon. The King's office issued a response that was unusually sharp. It stated that the distribution of personal royal assets was a private matter. It did not address the Duke's specific claim about the inheritance. It focused on the need for family privacy. This suggested that the request had hit a raw nerve. The King was clearly not prepared to have this conversation in the open. The Prince of Wales stepped into the void created by the statement. He was spotted at the Duke's residence shortly after the response was released. He stayed for 1 hour. The meeting was not on the official calendar. This was a clear sign that the palace was trying to manage the situation behind the scenes. They were trying to contain the Duke's message before it gained more traction. The facts were that the Prince of Wales agreed with the Duke's assessment of Catherine's role. He had been the one to encourage her to take a more prominent position in the public eye, but he was also aware of the political cost of the proposal. He knew that the Queen would never voluntarily give up the jewels. He knew that the request was a direct attack on her status. The Duke stood by his words. He was not intimidated by the pressure. He had spent his life in the shadow of the throne. He knew how to read the signals. He knew that the King was caught in an impossible position. He was betting that the public would support his stance on the preservation of the legacy. He was betting that the tradition outweighed the personal feelings of the Queen. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the garden. He knew that his words would be in the papers the next morning. He knew the fallout would be severe. He was prepared for it. He had decided that the integrity of the collection was worth the risk. He was the guardian of the history. He was the one who would hold the line. The palace staff worked through the night to prepare for the backlash. They were trying to coordinate the responses of the various family members. They wanted to ensure that no one else broke ranks. The office of the Queen was silent, but the intensity of the situation was clear. They were bracing for a battle of symbols. They were preparing to defend the status of the Queen at any cost. The night air was cool. The Duke sat back in his chair. He felt a sense of relief. He had said what needed to be said. He had forced the institution to confront a reality that they had been avoiding. He was the voice of the past, looking toward the future. He was ready for whatever came next. The battle for the jewels was officially open. The weight of history. Why Catherine? The Duke of Kent stood before a display case in the private royal archives. He gestured toward a collection of brooches that had been worn by 3 different queens over the last 200 years. He did not look at the craftsmanship. He looked at the provenance tags. He explained that these pieces were never meant to be ornaments. They were markers of continuity. He argued that their current placement outside of the main royal lineage created a symbolic void. He stood in the center of the room. He felt the history of the house pressing against the glass. The facts are that the royal jewel collection is governed by a complex web of sovereign property and private gifts. Some items are tied directly to the title of the monarch. Others were gifted to specific individuals. The Duke's argument hinges on the historical precedent of custodianship. He believes that the most significant pieces should remain with the person who holds the future of the house. He sees Catherine not just as a princess, but as the stabilizing force of the institution. He believes the crown jewels serve a purpose that transcends personal ownership. Tension flared when an advisor reminded him that Queen Camilla had already been photographed wearing several of these pieces at recent state events. The Duke turned sharply. He said that a photograph does not constitute a permanent transfer of legacy. He noted that the public perception of these jewels is tied to the strength and consistency of the wearer. He pointed out that Catherine's popularity had reached a level that the monarchy had not seen in a generation. He was not interested in the current optics. He was interested in the century-long endurance of the institution. He believes the public sees Catherine as the bridge to the future. He argues that by placing these historical assets with her, the king would be sending a powerful message about the longevity of the monarchy. He wants the jewels to be seen in the context of stability. He is not attacking the queen. He is advocating for the institution. He sees the jewels as tools of statecraft, not personal possessions. He paced the room. He spoke with the conviction of a man who had seen the rise and fall of many royal trends. The mystery remains why the Duke feels so strongly about this specific inheritance. He has never before involved himself in the private asset management of the king. Some speculate that he was asked by other senior royals to voice the concern. Others think he is reacting to the recent internal audits that have cast doubt on how the palace property is being handled. The Duke has spent his life in service to the crown. He knows the implications of every decision. He is not a man who acts without considering the consequences. The mystery resolved when he pointed to an unsigned note in the archive files. It was a memo from the late Queen. It suggested that the most important pieces should always be held by the person most actively engaged in the core royal duties. The Duke views Catherine's current workload as the fulfillment of that vision. He has found the justification he needs. He is now preparing to present this evidence directly to the king in their upcoming weekly meeting. He was convinced that the document provided the moral authority he needed to challenge the current status quo. The Duke looked at the assistant. He asked him to make copies of the memo. He wanted it prepared for the king's eyes before Monday. He knew that the king would be reluctant to act. He knew the pressure would be immense. But he also knew that the king respected the words of his mother above all others. If the late queen had intended for the jewels to follow the duty, then the path was clear. He would force the conversation. He walked to the archive door. He stopped and turned back to the display case. He looked at the tiaras and the collars of state. He imagined them resting on the Princess of Wales. He saw it not as a slight to the current queen, but as a necessary evolution for the survival of the dynasty. He believed that the house was at a turning point. He believed that the choices made today would dictate the relevance of the throne in 50 years. He was the guardian of the past, but he was also the architect of the future. The assistant left the room to make the copies. The Duke stayed behind for a few minutes. He was alone with the history of his family. He thought about the responsibilities he had taken on as a young man. He thought about the lessons he had learned from the years of service. He knew that he was making a significant break from protocol. He knew that some would view this as an act of betrayal, but he was at peace with the decision. He was protecting the institution from itself. He exited the archive. He walked through the long, quiet hallways of the palace. He passed the portraits of his ancestors. He felt like he was keeping a promise to each of them. He had done his duty to the crown for his entire life. He would do it again, even if it meant standing alone. He reached his private quarters and sat down at his desk. He began to write a letter to the king. It was the final step in the process. The letter was short. It focused on the duty of the monarch to protect the legacy. It did not use aggressive language. It focused on the historical weight of the collection. It was a masterclass in diplomacy and firm conviction. He finished it and sealed the envelope. He handed it to his secretary. He knew that the news of this letter would reach the queen within the hour. He was ready for the storm. The afternoon sun dipped behind the palace walls. The Duke stood by his window. He watched the activity in the courtyard. He saw the guards changing shifts. He saw the cars coming and going. The machine of the monarchy continued to turn. But he knew that a change was coming. He knew that the debate over the jewels was the start of a necessary reckoning. He was the catalyst for the change. He watched the lights come on in the distant offices. He stood his ground. The king's dilemma: protocol versus peace. The king sat at his desk in the private study at Sandringham. A single lamp illuminated the heavy, velvet-bound ledgers in front of him. The room felt smaller than usual. He was looking at a detailed inventory of family assets. Beside the ledger lay the formal, signed request from the Duke of Kent. The king rubbed his temples. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. He had spent the last 3 hours reviewing the history of the jewels. He was desperately searching for a way to satisfy the elder royals without causing a total, irreparable rupture with his wife. The facts are that the king is in a position of impossible leverage. He knows the historical argument for moving the jewels to Catherine. He also knows the stinging emotional cost of doing so. If he agrees with the Duke, he is publicly acknowledging that his wife's role is not the permanent center of the monarchy. If he ignores the request, he faces an open revolt from the senior members of his own family who view him as a weak steward of the crown. He is caught between the preservation of ancient tradition and the reality of his own private life. Tension in the study was palpable. A private secretary knocked softly on the heavy oak door. He asked if the king was ready for his scheduled afternoon call with the queen. The king hesitated. He looked at the document one last time. He realized that every choice he made today would define the next decade of his reign. He told the secretary to hold the call for 20 minutes. He was not ready to speak yet. He needed to find the language of compromise. He was searching for a path that wouldn't shatter the foundation of his home. The mystery was how the queen had discovered the exact content of the Duke's request. She had made a series of urgent hush calls to the estate managers during the early hours of the morning. It was clear that she had been alerted to the move by an insider within the king's own office. She was not waiting for the king to decide on his own timeline. She was already organizing a defense. She was gathering her own legal team to argue for the sanctity of her private holdings. She was fighting for her place in the history of the house. The mystery resolved when the king received a sealed envelope marked "personal" at the door. It contained a list of the specific pieces the queen considered to be her absolute, non-negotiable property. She had made it clear, in blunt terms, that she would not relinquish them without a public fight. She had drawn her own line in the sand. The king realized that he was being forced into a public battle that he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. He saw the conflict not just as a matter of jewelry, but as a fight for legitimacy. A new mystery opened as the king stood up and walked to the fireplace. He looked at the dying embers. He realized that the Duke of Kent had not acted alone in this push. He saw the signatures of 2 other senior cousins at the bottom of the request. This was not a lone protest from an elderly relative. It was a coordinated faction of the old guard. He knew then that the fight for the jewels was only the beginning of a larger, systemic campaign to dictate the future of his entire household. They wanted to steer the direction of the reign from the shadows. The king stepped back from the fire. He reached for his personal telephone. He decided to call the Princess of Wales directly. He needed to know her position before he spoke to the Queen. He needed to know if she was a willing participant in this power play, or if she was being used as a symbol by the elders. The call was brief. Catherine was composed. She stated that she had no desire for the jewels under these circumstances. She expressed a deep concern for the unity of the family. This revelation changed the landscape of the king's dilemma. He realized that the Duke of Kent was acting on his own interpretation of the past, rather than the wishes of the future. He felt a sudden clarity. He decided to draft a response to the Duke. He would affirm the importance of the collection, but he would also assert his authority as the sovereign to manage the distribution. He would decline the request to bypass the Queen, while simultaneously promising a formal review of the asset legacy. It was a tactical compromise. He sat back down at his desk. He began to draft the note. His handwriting was steady. He articulated that the stability of the monarchy required a unified front. He noted that the public debate over the jewelry was a distraction that the crown could not afford at this volatile time. He made it clear that, while he valued the historical counsel of the Duke, the final decision on the placement of royal assets would remain with the throne. He was reasserting his power. The king finished the letter and signaled for his secretary. He handed over the document with an instruction to deliver it immediately. He stood up and finally walked to the window. He watched the rain fall on the gardens. He felt the weight of the crown pressing down on him. He had navigated the crisis, but he knew the internal division was far from over. The faction of the old guard had been warned, and the Queen had been defended, but the tension remained. He turned back to the room. He felt a sense of relief, tempered by the knowledge that his reign would be defined by these constant small battles for control. He was the keeper of the flame, but he was also the man at the center of the fire. He sat down and picked up the ledger again. There were still a dozen other issues to resolve before the night was over. The work of the monarchy never stopped. He was ready for the next move. The dilemma was paused, but the war for the future was still very much alive. The palace backlash. Camilla's reaction. The phone in the Queen's private suite rang at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was not a usual hour for administrative calls. She picked it up after the second ring. She listened to the update from her senior aide. She did not say a word for nearly a minute. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror of her dressing table. Her face was set. She set the phone down gently. She went to her closet. She pulled out a tailored suit for her morning engagement. The fact is that the Queen has spent years building her position within the household. She has navigated the skepticism of the public and the internal dynamics of the family. She has developed a thick skin. She does not react to rumors. But the challenge from the Duke of Kent was different. It was a direct attack on her status. It was a formal move to undermine her role. She saw it as a deliberate attempt to strip her of the symbols of her office. Tension rose as she left the room. Her staff was moving with an unusual sense of urgency. The news of the Duke's letter had reached the main offices. The chatter in the halls was constant. The Queen walked through the corridor. She ignored the anxious glances of the footmen. She went straight to her office. She called in her head of communications. She gave her a single instruction. She told her to prepare a brief statement emphasizing her long years of service. The Queen's reaction was not one of panic. It was one of cold, calculated defense. She had anticipated that there would be efforts to limit her influence as the king's reign continued. She had built her own network of loyalists within the palace administration. She picked up her pen. She wrote a note to the king's private secretary. She reminded him that her access to the crown jewels was part of her official duties as queen. The mystery was how the Duke of Kent had managed to get the signatures of the other senior royals on his request. The Queen had spent the last 2 months hosting dinners and meetings to ensure her support within the family. She had believed that the consensus was with her. She realized now that she had been missing the shift in the tides. She had been focused on the public image while the internal power structures were moving against her. The mystery resolved when she checked the internal logs of the palace visitors. She saw that the Duke of Kent had met with 2 other senior cousins at a private club in the city just 3 days ago. They had been planning this move. They had been building a case for weeks. She had been outmaneuvered in her own house. The realization was sharp. She had underestimated the depth of the resistance. The facts were that the Queen's office had already begun to leak counter-information to the press. They were highlighting the lack of historical precedent for the Duke's claim. They were framing the request as an act of desperation from an aging faction. They were painting the Duke as a man out of touch with the modern needs of the monarchy. They were launching a full-scale public relations campaign to neutralize the threat. A new mystery emerged within the lunch hour. The king had not yet issued a public response to the Duke. The silence from the king's office was becoming a story in itself. The queen wondered if he was stalling. She wondered if he was considering the proposal. She decided to pay a visit to his study. She needed to know where he stood. She needed to hear his thoughts directly. She knocked on the door. The king was there. He looked tired. He did not look up from his papers. The queen asked him if he had received the Duke's letter. The king nodded. She asked him what he intended to do about it. The king sighed. He told her that he was managing the situation. He did not offer any comfort. He did not offer a defense of her position. He simply repeated that he was in control. The queen felt a chill. She realized that the king was trying to remain neutral. He was trying to avoid taking a side in what he viewed as a family dispute. She saw this as a dangerous mistake. She knew that in the world of the palace, there was no such thing as neutrality. You were either defending the current order, or you were allowing it to be dismantled. She left the study without another word. She walked back to her office. She felt a sense of isolation. She realized that she had to lead her own defense. She picked up her phone again. She called her legal team. She told them to prepare a full audit of her official gifts and the provenance of every piece of jewelry she had used in the last 5 years. She would provide the evidence that her position was secure. The staff watched her as she worked. They saw the focus. They saw the resolve. They knew that the queen was not going to give up without a fight. The palace was in a state of quiet agitation. The staff were forced to choose sides. The atmosphere in the offices became fractured. The unity of the administration was falling apart. The afternoon ended with the release of the Queen's statement. It was brief. It mentioned her commitment to the duties of the crown. It did not mention the jewels. It did not mention the Duke. It was a statement of strength. It was a declaration that she was not going anywhere. The press started to report on the palace divide. The story was no longer about the jewels. It was about the Queen's hold on the throne. The Queen stood by the window. She watched the evening light fade. She knew that this was just the first round. She knew that there would be more challenges to her authority in the coming months. She was ready. She had survived worse. She had earned her place. She would not be pushed aside by the old guard. She turned off the lights in her office. She left the room. The struggle for the palace was far from over. The legal and symbolic stakes. The mahogany desk in the office of the chief legal counsel was covered in parchment documents. These were not modern contracts. They were historical grants of sovereign authority. The counsel, a man of 60 years, adjusted his glasses. He ran his hand over a deed dated to 1842. He was looking for a specific clause. It dictated the ownership of the state regalia. The room was silent. A clock ticked on the wall. He was searching for a way to define what could be legally moved and what had to stay. The facts are that the legal standing of the royal jewels is complex. Many pieces were personal gifts to the monarchs. These fall under private trust law. They are not part of the state collection. They can be passed down as inheritance. Others are designated as the property of the crown. They are legally tied to the office of the monarch. The Duke of Kent's challenge focuses on the ones that are currently categorized as private trusts. He is arguing that these should be reclassified for the sake of the institution. Tension filled the room when the counsel's assistant walked in. He carried a new memo from the king's office. It demanded an immediate assessment of the potential for a public lawsuit. The king wanted to know if a challenge from the Duke could be blocked in the courts. He wanted to know if he had the power to stop the narrative before it became a matter of public record. The counsel read the memo. He sighed. He knew that the courts would be a disaster. The mystery was why the Duke had decided to push this now. He had lived through decades of royal asset disputes without ever raising his voice. He had seen the distribution of jewels after the death of the late queen. He had remained silent then. Something had changed in his calculation of the monarchy's future. The counsel looked at the patterns of the Duke's recent public engagements. He noticed a shift. He had been spending more time with the younger generation of royals. The mystery resolved when the counsel found a folder of emails. They were from the Duke's personal office. They were sent to the curators of the royal collection. They contained inquiries about the status of pieces that had not been worn in over 30 years. It was not about the current queen. It was about the long-term preservation of the physical history of the house. The Duke was not fighting a person. He was fighting the perceived decline of the collection's significance. The facts were that the legal stakes had reached a boiling point. If the Duke succeeded in forcing a public debate, it would set a precedent. It would open every asset in the royal household to scrutiny. Every piece of jewelry, every estate, and every trust would be subject to the question of its institutional value. The king's legal team knew that this would lead to a total loss of privacy for the monarch's family. They had to stop it. A new mystery emerged by the end of the day. A leaked document appeared on a social media site. It was an internal memo from the Queen's legal team. It detailed the steps they were taking to secure the title of the jewels. It listed the names of 3 independent experts they had hired to verify the status of the pieces. The document was dated 3 days before the Duke of Kent had even sent his request. She had known the challenge was coming. The council read the leaked memo. He realized that the Queen had been tipped off well in advance. She had not been surprised by the Duke's move. She had been prepared for it. He wondered who had been leaking the information from the Duke's office. He realized that there was a mole in the old guard. He began to cross-reference the digital signatures of the leaked memo with the internal server logs of the palace. The legal strategy of the house was in tatters. The Queen was working on a separate track from the King's office. She was not coordinating her defense with the sovereign. She was acting as an independent entity. The council realized that the monarchy was effectively being run by 2 separate administrations. He picked up his phone. He called the king. He told him that he needed to speak to him in person. The situation had moved beyond legal advice. The council walked to the king's study. He passed the staff in the hallway. They looked at him with apprehension. The air in the palace felt fragile. He entered the study. The king was waiting. He looked at the lawyer. He asked him for the blunt truth. The council laid the situation out. He said that a public legal battle would destroy the last remnants of the family's unity. He urged the king to find a political solution. The king listened without interrupting. He looked at the window. He was a man who had spent his life preparing for this role. He knew the cost of compromise. He also knew the cost of war. He told the council that he would talk to the Queen again. He would try to reach an agreement on the custody of the jewels. He would try to frame it as a long-term loan to the Princess of Wales. It was a compromise that satisfied the letter of the law, but avoided the public fight. The council left the study. He felt the weight of the task ahead. He had to draft the agreement. He had to make it look like a decision of the family, not a result of a legal threat. He went back to his desk. He started to outline the terms. He worked through the night. The palace was quiet, but he knew that the quiet was deceptive. The battle lines had been drawn. The legal and symbolic stakes were higher than they had ever been. The morning light touched the roof of the palace. The council put down his pen. He had finished the draft. He knew that the struggle would continue. The jewels were just the focal point. The real battle was for the identity of the future monarchy. He watched the sunrise. He was ready for the next move. The fate of the institution rested on the signature of the king. The struggle was the price of the crown. A new front in the royal war. The press room at the entrance of the palace was packed with reporters. The air was hot. Dozens of cameras were aimed at the podium. A spokesperson stood before the microphones. He looked at the sheet of paper in his hand. He did not smile. He read the announcement that the king had reviewed the request regarding the royal collection. He stated that the integrity of the heritage was a priority for the entire family. The room erupted with questions. The facts were that the announcement did not offer a solution. It affirmed the historical significance of the jewels. It mentioned that the king was in talks with all parties to ensure a resolution that reflected the values of the institution. It was a classic administrative pivot. It kept the issue alive while preventing an immediate crisis. The Duke of Kent watched the broadcast from his private study. He took a sip of tea. He knew that the fight had only just begun. Tension shifted to the public reception. Supporters of the Princess of Wales took to social media. They argued that her dedication to the crown made her the rightful steward of the historical pieces. Critics of the Queen's family used the controversy to highlight their ongoing grievances. The narrative had escaped the control of the palace officials. It was no longer an internal debate. It was a national issue. The mystery was who had leaked the details of the king's internal compromise to a leading tabloid an hour before the press conference. The story correctly identified that a custodianship model was being discussed behind closed doors. This model would allow the Queen to keep the pieces for state events, while moving the ownership title to the official royal collection. Someone inside the King's inner circle was playing both sides. The mystery resolved when the digital footprint of the leak was traced. It led back to the office of the regional director, who had been fired following the horticultural show incident. He was still in possession of an active staff login that had not been revoked. He was using his remaining access to sabotage the palace from the outside. The security team was notified within minutes. The account was finally deleted. A new mystery opened as the sun set over the palace. The Princess of Wales received a package at her door. It contained no return address. Inside, she found a single antique brooch that had been missing from the royal records for over 40 years. It was one of the pieces mentioned in the Duke's request. She held it in her hand. It was cold. She walked to her desk and picked up the phone. She did not call the King. She called the Duke of Kent. The war was taking a turn into the unknown. The Duke of Kent has pulled the curtain back on a deep, simmering divide within the monarchy. By challenging the distribution of the crown jewels, he has transformed a private asset dispute into a public battle for the soul of the institution. As the King struggles to balance his wife's status with the demands of the old guard, the Princess of Wales has been pulled into the center of a storm she never asked to join. With mysterious gifts appearing and leaks originating from the shadows, the war for the royal legacy is escalating. Who will hold the crown next?